I mentioned in my opening comments that our AFT Raising the Bar report highlights the confused nature of the field of teacher preparation. And a quote from it is, "A fragmented and bureaucratic tangle of stakeholder groups with varied, sometimes overlapping responsibilities and blurred accountability lines." So my question to the panelists for a short, crisp answer is, how does this fragmentation complicate the question of teacher preparation reform, and what can be done to bring about sustainable change given the multiple stakeholders and the complications I referenced? And if, Kate, you're willing to address it first, I'd appreciate it.
The fragmentation is, I think Deborah put it best. I mean, the field has failed to agree on what is the knowledge and the skills that teachers need to enter the classroom. And in fact, NCTQ has taken quite a bit of heat for the fact that we tried to identify those knowledge and skills down to the level of specificity that Deborah alluded to. And you know, and I take the criticism to heart, but on the other hand, I think it's really troubling that we had to do that. You know, it just seemed like the field's been around 100 years in reasonable health, and that it had yet to agree on sort of core knowledge and skills that teachers need. You know, when we've gone to visit programs, one program requires vastly different coursework to prepare the same kind of teacher as a program down the street or even on the same campus. And you just have to reflect on how has that come to be? How has that come to be that we haven't agreed on even the most fundamental issues of how many science courses a middle school science teacher needs? You know, so it's a problem.
Hey, Michael, I'm going to turn to you again, the tangled web of teacher preparation stakeholders, and would like to hear your viewpoint.
Well, I agree with the historical reminder that Deborah and to some extent Kate have provided, that this fragmentation didn't start 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. This has been part of the design of the Republic. We were quite consciously, from the beginning, allergic to a system of education that had a lot of centralized command. And when it comes to the decisions about what exactly is the core competence required for entry-level teaching, I'm sort of optimistic, given Deborah's work and others, that we might actually come up with at least some approximation or some guidance to the field as to what that would actually entail. But I do worry a little bit about the possibility that too much emphasis on standardization as an alternative to fragmentation would snuff out exactly the kind of innovative programs that we turn to when we're looking for models of things that might actually make the system work better. And I was not familiar with the program that Claire was describing, but I sure want to get more familiar with it. And the question I would ask is, if we came up with a system of or a set of principles that all entry-level teachers needed, what would be what might be the effects on, or what might be the disincentives to people to develop the kinds of programs that do cater to special kinds of needs and to special parts of special segments of the population. My only other comment here is that when it comes to the data that Kate and Deborah have presented about the sorry state of teacher preparation, let's assume that a lot of that is true. The question that I think is on the minds of a lot of people is whether the approach to evaluation of teacher preparation is actually going to be useful to combat the problem that has been identified. There's no evidence in any literature that I'm familiar with that simply providing a kind of public ranking, which is associated with a certain amount of embarrassment and even shaming of institutions, is the right way to actually encourage any kind of program improvement. So here we're talking about a difference between the goals and the means, and I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Thank you, and I'm going to turn to Claire briefly. Again, a couple thoughts on the fragmented tangle of stakeholder groups.
So I think what's been interesting as I listen to people is we've been talking about agreeing on a common set of knowledge and skills. But as I hear the question in terms of stakeholder groups, what I think about are stakeholder groups generally have economic and political interests in doing what they're doing and continuing to do it in the way that they're doing it. I think that unless this is tackled from that perspective, we cannot build a unified field. And so you have universities, some universities, let me qualify that, you have some universities that see teacher education programs as cash cows. That presents certain problems economically, and that's a fragmentation in the field. We have a disrespect for the knowledge in the field of the practitioners, including the exemplary practitioners who do exist and are out in the field. And we have no way of tying the work of exemplary practitioners in a systemic way to the work of teacher training programs.
Thank you. And Deborah, again, the confused nature of teacher prep, considering the variety and diversity of stakeholders.
I think you can hear in our comments something that's very special about being Americans and has to do with our love of supporting lots of different ways to get there. In my view, saying that we need a common standard of entry to the classroom doesn't wipe out the possibility that programs will work in different ways to get there. We want a diverse workforce. It's quite likely, I think, that as we dig into this, that different people who bring different kinds of experiences to initial teacher training will need somewhat different ways of beginning to use their resources of their past experience and learn new professional skill. I'm never arguing that all the programs need to look alike. What I am arguing is that there needs to be agreement on what someone has to be able to do before we allow them to practice on children. And given that there is some local variation, of course, I mean, it was different to teach in the school I taught than in the school lots of my colleagues taught. You could imagine that the common standard of entry capitalizes on 80% of what it is somebody has to know to enter the classroom, leaving room for things that are specialized to the local context. We tend to get it backwards, where most of it is about local and individual and supporting innovation, and very little about it is common. I'm trying to argue we need to shift toward much more that's common and is about entry to independent, responsible practice in the first year.
Thank you. We have a short amount of time, and we're going to turn to the audience. And I would remind myself, if I was sitting out there, please ask a question and refrain from so much as commenting, but posing a question to our panelists.
Hi, Joan
Yes, please do identify yourself.
Barrett Snowden. I don't know if this is working, but I'll use it. Okay. I agree with what Michael said about problems with evaluation. And in fact, Kate's slide where it showed there was no difference between traditional education, accredited education, and uncertified in terms of outcome of these first-year students is just the fact that you have Oral Roberts University and Teachers College in the traditional claimed and class program and fly-by-night in the alternate, and uncertified, you have somebody taught for 30 years in a private school. So it just, those data reflect the fragmentation that we've been talking about. But what I'm really fascinated by and has me stumped on a paper I've prepared is I came to the conclusion that everybody has in terms of a profession is a profession if it has some common standard practices with levels of agreement, etc. And I don't know how we get that. I understand that's the problem. My question to Debbie and the rest is, how do we begin to create those common professional agreements.
Thank you, Joan. And Deb, I will let you an attempt and answer first.
I think that we worry much more about the idea of trying to do that than trying to do that. When I've worked with very different groups, including teacher unions of both groups and people from different kinds of colleges and universities, as well as alternative programs, once you start talking about the actual things that you'd want a beginning teacher to do, there's far more agreement than you would expect. I think we're afraid to try, and I think it would have to be a coalition of unlikely partners to say enough is enough already, and we actually can do this. Anyone, as Claire has taught, and all these teachers who are out there are going to help us a lot with this. You cannot teach in your first year if you can't lead a whole group discussion, if you can't ask kids to talk and get them to talk to you. This isn't going to be something that takes years and years to figure out. What's hard is to figure out how you unpack and teach this to beginners so that they're skillful enough when they get out there on their own so that they can keep learning in the environments they're in.
Thank you. So Claire, Kate, Michael, do any of you wish to comment on Joan's question?
All I'd add to Deborah's spot-on analysis of this is that, that settling on standards is not that hard, and that there is evidence that what NCTQ is doing is going to move the needle. We have gotten more specific than anything out there at the moment, and there is evidence that even institutions respond to even superficial rankings and ratings. We've hoped that by creating a system of very comprehensive and meaningful standards against which we are rating programs, that we'll motivate programs to want to improve so that aspiring teachers will make choices about going to better institutions. School districts will hire from teachers who have graduated from more high-performing institutions. And so we believe that the answer is the marketplace. We've lost faith in the ability of states to put their foot down here, and then there's ample evidence that states won't do the right thing and close programs that are not functioning well. But we do believe that the one thing that higher ed understands is loss of income and loss of students.
Thank you.
I'd like to say, I think that Deborah's point is correct, that it is not necessarily going to be that complicated to get to the content, but we have to make sure that we have a broad group of people, given the fragmentation and the distrust that exists one side to the other among the various players involved. There needs to be a concerted effort to bring a lot of people to the table. I would also say that my experience on the secondary level with the marketplace as solving the problems in education is that it hasn't played out very well. The SIG grants have showed that there hasn't been substantial success in improving education. I'm less familiar with how that will play out at the university level, but I suspect that students aren't going to necessarily travel or pay the price of different programs based on a ranking. They may in their own geographic area, but I don't see how that's going to solve the problem fundamentally. I think there has to be an agreement on what you need to know and be able to do.
Michael?
Well, I think it's been said. Look, I'm as big an optimist about the power of consensus on this sort of thing, and I hope that we can come up with some kind of process that will listen carefully to the experience and the knowledge of working teachers, and at the same time, push ourselves as a field toward some agreement about these common initial entry standards, or whatever we want to call them. It strikes me that the references to the market as a way to accomplish that are sort of strange, given that neither the countries nor the states that have actually been doing a good job with teachers and teaching necessarily would have adopted anything like our sort of market orientation on this. I don't get that part of the logic. If we're trying to become, better in the way we teach our children, compared to, for example, some of the other countries where they're doing a better job of it. The irony is that the countries that are outperforming us would never think of doing a kind of accountability system that we seem to have come up with. So I'm certainly in favor of the principle of looking for some ways to strengthen the profession by getting common agreement on what it takes to really be and to encourage safe practice for initial entry teaching. I just don't necessarily think that we've got the mechanism in place that's going to get us there.
Okay, thank you, and I'm going to give Kate a brief response here to the notion of marketplace that you just commented on.
Well, it's been pointed out before, there's a lot that's uniquely American about our current system, and leave it to the concept of a marketplace to reinforce that notion. I would certainly find it easier to think that states and the U.S. government and the field itself could come to some better agreement on how to solve this dilemma before us. But in spite of multiple efforts within the field going back decades, and in spite of multiple efforts by the federal government through Title II HEA and state accountability, we've not seen any movement. So that would probably be the path that would be preferred. But I look to the marketplace to do what none of those entities has been willing to do to date.
Thank you, and we have a couple minutes remaining. And if you have a very brief question, we will entertain that.
So I'm Jerome Dancis, and I'm a retired mathematics professor from the University of Maryland. Well, first I'll say thank you to the panel for the nice presentations. I'll say a shout out to Paul and ask her a question. Perhaps you could be somewhat specific about just how much mathematics a grade 7 math teacher and a grade 7 science teacher should be required to know before a state provides them with a teaching license.
That was a brief question. I appreciate it. Who
I think
wishes?
that, oh.
Go ahead,
was
please.
answering?
Deborah,
Want me to
please.
answer?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Yes, sorry. I think that we need in the short term to be moving away from counting courses or naming the actual number of courses, but instead building assessments of the kind of content, the use of content, the kind of content judgment, the kind of content knowledge, being able to explain an idea, being able to evaluate whether a textbook treats the subject correctly. We need assessments of that type to pin down what we're talking about here. As long as we keep making lists, there'll be no accountability that people actually enter the teaching force knowing their content well enough. So if we started by saying, what will a first-year teacher have to do in 7th grade science or in 7th grade math, and what perspective will they have to know about those subjects beyond those grade levels, and what do they need to know about what comes before, and locate those in the actual acts of teaching, like explaining an idea, asking a good question, posing the next problem, and the like, I think we will get some leverage in a way that we haven't over the last decade.
Deborah,
you.
if I
Kate?
could this is the only thing you've said all day that I disagree with at all. And
That's part of the record.
yeah, and I think that's part of the problem here. NCTQ has put forth an assertion that all elementary teachers ought to get 9 credit, or it's really actually 8 credits if they're going to an institution of average selectivity in elementary mathematics. And we've taken a lot of heat for that. It's like, well, that's so arbitrary. 3 courses, that's so arbitrary. But it wasn't arbitrary. We did begin with the exact question you just asked and said, what are the topics you need to cover to be competent in teaching K-5 mathematics? And we go through those 12 topics, and we know how long it takes to each one because we consult with mathematicians who do this, and we came up with that standard. And I think there's a certain simple elegance to the notion that, and a level of clarity that standard brings to the table. And it's nuanced. You can say if you can pass a math test like of the caliber that Massachusetts has put in place, I don't care if you make a candidate take any courses if they can pass that test. But I think one of the reasons the field is so deeply struggling is because it hears stuff like you should have 2 reading courses or 3 reading courses or whatever. I'm not going to impose the number in that instance. And it objects to it and says, "Oh, you're taking away my ability to innovate. Oh, you're treating us like cookie cutters." When in fact, some flavor of that, I think, is missing and would be helpful, and programs would actually embrace the idea that there is a little bit more clarity to what they ought to be doing in the course of preparing candidates. We are so committed to the idea of innovation that we forget that there's a fundamental body of knowledge and skills that takes, on average, a certain amount of time. And why is there such a disrespect for the idea that a course in something is important to have?
May I comment on that?
Yes?
Sure.
I'm not at all saying people shouldn't take coursework. I just don't think that the container we call a course at a university tells us anything at all about whether people learn the kind of content and to do the things with the content that they need. And I would, with all due respect to my many mathematician colleagues, not consider them to be the experts about what the demands of teaching 3rd grade are, which I did for many, many, many years. So understanding the mathematical demands of 3rd grade teaching would tell you what those courses should include in a very useful way that we've never done. So I'm not disagreeing that we need courses. I'm just saying we'll get there faster if we're clear with ourselves about what we want a beginning teacher to do with mathematics and then line up the courses.
Well,
there will be people who need 8 courses to get there, and there will be people who need 1 course to get there.
Well, just to be clear, our math standard had many math educators serving on it, including people that work for you. So it was not something that was arbitrary or fulfilled simply by mathematicians. It was a conversation that was much broader than that.
So I am going to take this opportunity to thank our wonderful panelists, Claire Sylvan, Kate Walsh, Michael Foyer, and Deborah Ball, for participating in this edition of Reclaiming the Promise of Public Education, a conversation series sponsored by the American Federation of Teachers and the Albert Shanker Institute. And thank you to the members in the audience for your interest and your attention and your participation. Have a good afternoon.